And my name is Dai Yamao from Kyushu University, and I'm very honored to be a chair of this panel. Our speaker, our panelists, first panelist will be Dr. Victor Cotton of the Middle East Institute of National University of Singapore, and he's a specialist of the legal affairs in the Palestinian issue. And the second speaker will be the Miss Naira Ali Gauri Hamse. She is the PhD student of Tokyo University of Foreign Studies. And the third speaker will be the Professor Ayako Sasaki of the College of Liberal Arts and Science of Chiba University, and she's specialist of the social workers of Japan. And another speaker will be the Associate Professor Reiko Ogawa of the Graduate School of Social Science in Chiba University, and she's specialist of the gender care migration issue in East Asia. Okay, so in order to save time, we will invite the first speaker, Dr. Victor, and his presentation title will be the persistence of the Palestinian refugee issues, refugee programs. You have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Dr. Yamao, and good afternoon. So my name is Victor Cotton. I'm a senior research fellow here at the Middle East Institute in Singapore. I've been here for almost 5 years. I moved here from Ramallah, where I was advising the Palestinian Authority on legal issues connected to the peace process. So my talk today is on one of the files of that peace process, one of many unresolved files, perhaps one of the most difficult of the files, which is the Palestinian refugee problem. And as we've heard from Francesca, this has been going on for a long time. For at least 70 years, although if you want to understand how the refugee problem arose, we have to go back even earlier. So this is a dispute it's almost a century, just over a century old. So unsurprisingly, I'm going to be spending a bit of time on history. Again, Francesca covered a bit of this, but I'll probably be going into a little bit more depth on the big, if you like, political issues. So revisiting the British colonial period, we've heard the Brits have been involved in quite a few refugee crises in the world, from Myanmar to other places, and that's also the case with the Palestine Mandate. And then I'll look really what happened, if you like, towards the end of the League of Nations period and the creation of the United Nations, and explain why the Palestinian refugee situation is treated differently to other refugees, because the 1951 convention, because the Convention on Refugees didn't exist at the time. So I'll explain why they're unique, and then I'll say a few things about why the peace process has failed. And again, it's the same issue. It goes right back to the first peace talks in Lausanne in 1949 and just festered until the present. So let me begin with the historical reasons. So the territory of, you could call it part of Western Asia, the Levant, that became Palestine, was a League of Nations mandate. So it was established out of the First World War, when the region was divided between Britain and France. And Palestine was singled out as territory where it was the intention of the British government to establish a national home for the Jewish people. Now, of course, Palestine at the time was a populated country. There were Jews already living there in small numbers, but most were Muslims and Christians. But at the same time, the League of Nations mandate system calls for the creation of if you like, special entities that would become states in the future, and this was based on the idea of Wilson's national self-determination, or consent of the governed, and the Covenant spoke of safeguarding the well-being and development of all of the population of Palestine. So immediately you had two clashing interests. One, to establish a national home for the Jewish people in the Balfour Declaration, and then the indigenous community, if you like, saying we live here, we're the majority, we want our own home, we're not happy about this British policy. And to cut a long story short, this led to a major political dispute during the British period, so from 1917 up until the end of the mandate in 1948. And what's crucial to understanding is what actually happened towards the end. So I won't go into all the things that happened during the mandate. I can do that in the questions if you're interested. But what's really key to understanding what happened is what happened at the end of the Second World War, when you had the League of Nations system that was dissolved after the United Nations was established. So we actually had a 6-month period where, on paper at least, you had two international organizations existing side by side, the United Nations and the League of Nations. Now, as a mandate territory, Palestine had a special international status. It wasn't an ordinary colony like Kenya or like India, where Britain would simply transfer power by passing an act in its legislature, its parliament, and then leaving. It had to involve the United Nations because it was an international territory. And so Britain asked the United Nations what to do. It had this dispute between Arabs and Jews, and so the United Nations said, sure, we'll look at the issue. Special committees were established to look into the issue. There was a division of opinion, no surprise there, but a majority of the committee favoured a partition plan, which we will look at. But for reasons that were connected to the way in which the Palestinians and the countries within the region thought the partition plan was unfair, as I will explain. There was a dispute between the United States and the UK, and then there was a reversal of policy, and the idea was to place Palestine on a 10-year UN trusteeship. Again, there was dispute in the UN, and so the British government just left. They just walked out. And there was a war, there was chaos. The UN was suddenly responsible. You could argue the British were actually also responsible. And so the UN has been, if you like, the Israelis would complain, they've been obsessed with Palestine for the last 70 years. But there's a reason for that, and that's because the UN was given responsibility at the end of the mandate for resolving the issue, and that's why you have so many resolutions year by year specifically on this issue. Now let's take a closer look at the UN partition plan. I've got the map here, which you can see, and I've given you the breakdown in the votes. You can see that that there was a majority were in favor of partition, although I should say when they spoke of partition, they envisaged free movement of people, a joint economic zone, special international status for Jerusalem, Nazareth, and an economic corridor with Jaffa. But the people who were against it said it was still unfair because the Palestinian Arabs still owned most of the land, were still the majority population, and so they were naturally against this. And interestingly, when you look at the vote, the British government also thought the plan was unfair and abstained. And all of the countries in the region and beyond were against it. Interestingly, India and Pakistan also voted against the plan. They'd experienced partition a few months previously. Now, when the plan happened, there was an outbreak of violence, initially mostly between Arabs and Jews, and the British mandatory authorities supposedly trying to hold the balance between them. But this then changed when the British withdrew on the 15th of May, and there's been all kinds of stories about tacit agreements between the Jordanians and the Jewish Agency and the Haganah, etc. But what happened is Britain pulls out, and you have the Arab countries, particularly the main armies of the Arab Legion from Transjordan and Egypt, going in and fighting the Haganah, the Irgun, and other organizations. And it was during this conflict that you had a lot of the, if you like, the exodus or expulsion of the Palestinians. This is showing you in the dots areas are the abandoned Palestinian villages. I just want to draw your attention to something that's rather interesting, and it's this area here, which you will see has been left almost untouched. And if we look at the modern map of Israel today, we'll see this area is where the majority of the Palestinians, Arabs, who are citizens of Israel, live today. Now let's go back 2 slides to the UN partition plan, and you'll see it's this part here. So there appears to have been, it wasn't an accident, there appears to have been some coordination. The idea was to grab as much land as you could in the area delineated for the Arab states in the UN partition plan by the Arab states and for the Jewish states. So the Haganah seems to have left that part untouched. So there appears to have been some coordination. Be that as it may, this didn't make much of a difference for all of those Palestinians who lived in that part of that part that would become the State of Israel. So as in most war situations, you initially have flight and panic. There were atrocities. There were also rumors, deliberately exaggerated rumors of atrocities in order to create a sense of panic, and therefore people fled. So these are images taken from Haifa. People fled onto boats, in this case to Lebanon in the West Bank and Gaza. You had people fleeing mainly to Jordan. Jordan continues to have the largest number of Palestinians until today. In the middle of the Exodus, and I should also have said it was in April 1948 that you saw the biggest, April to July 1948, that you see the biggest exodus of Palestinians. And again, this is directly connected to developments in the United Nations, because that was the month when the United States decided to oppose or began to consider a UN trusteeship plan that would have kept the territory intact, therefore implicitly recognizing it as an Arab state. Initially, the people, and then Israel proclaimed its independence in the middle of this, in the 15th of May 1948. So as soon as the Brits pull out, Israel proclaims its independence. Hajj Amin al-Hussein, no one mentions this, also proclaimed independence from the Gaza Strip, but he was too weak and divided at the time, and nobody recognized a Palestinian state at the time. No, that's not fair. The Arab Legion did, but the League of Arab States did, but there was a dispute between Egypt and Transjordan, because Transjordan at the time decided to incorporate the West Bank into Jordan proper, which is what they did up until 1967, and then in 1988 they relinquished their claim. Now, initially, those who came in, who stepped in to help deal with the refugee crisis, was non-governmental organizations, the Red Cross, the Catholic Relief Societies, etc. And it wasn't until later that the United Nations became involved. You've got to remember, in those days there weren't modern communications. It took a while for information to get to Paris with the General Assembly and in New York. So, and just to show you a picture of the camps 10 years later, they looked like prefabricated housing, and now they look like shanty towns or suburbs of major cities. Okay, and then we bring to the issue of why they have a unique refugee status, and how the UN became involved in assisting the refugees after these NGOs moved out. So one thing I want to make that's sometimes overlooked is that Palestine was treated differently because it was seen as being connected to European politics, despite the fact that it was in the Middle East. And this is for historic reasons, and primarily to do is initially with the holy places, the fact that Jerusalem was in Palestine, but also connected to events in Central Europe during the war. So when the United Nations Convention on Refugees was adopted, it was only adopted in 1951, the people who drafted it primarily had in mind European refugees displaced during the war. So it didn't apply to other situations until this was remedied in 1967. Some countries like India, Pakistan, a lot of Asian countries have not signed it until this day, saying it was discriminatory, only applied to Europeans. But Palestine, of course, was an issue that arose before 1951. But as we heard from Francesca, it had its own separate refugee, it had its own ad hoc UN agencies that were established to deal with it. And so what the 1951 convention did, it just maintained, said if you're not part of that system, then you fall under the convention. So some of these ad hoc bodies include, well, it was initially the United Nations Mediator for Palestine, who was actually involved in the Red Cross during the Holocaust in Sweden. He was actually assassinated during the war in 1948. But his final report led to the establishment of the United Nations Conciliation Commission for Palestine, which was established by Resolution 194, paragraph 3. I'll say a little bit more about that in a minute. And then later, the UNRWA, United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestinian Refugees, was established. So in other words, you already had these ad hoc bodies That's why they weren't included in the UN refugee system, because they already existed. But they would only fall under that if they were outside the areas where UNRWA operates, which is Lebanon, Syria, Jordan, and the occupied territories. Now let's have a little closer look at the UNCCP, the United Nations Conciliation Commission. So this differed to UNRWA. It wasn't because it was looking for a durable solution to the issue. It was more political in character. It wasn't just looking for relief for refugees, but actually trying to resolve the issue. And it was mandated to do several things, including, interestingly, Jerusalem, which was interesting because of what President Trump recently said. But they also had a mandate to look at the refugee issue, and the primary aim was to return. So the refugees who wish to return to their homes and are willing to live at peace should be permitted to do so as earliest as possible, right? And compensation was to be paid for their property, and also for those who chose not to return, etc., under principles of international law. And the Conciliation Commission was to facilitate repatriation, resettlement, etc. In a nutshell, this organization existed for a few years, but it went nowhere because the State of Israel and the Arab states could not come to an agreement over this very issue. However, it still exists as an office in New York, and it has very valuable data on the value of refugee property, statistics, etc., etc. And there are still resolutions passed at the UN every year. UNRWA was different. It was established later on, and it stepped in again. As I mentioned, you had those pictures of the tents and the Catholic relief societies and the UN agencies. UNRWA kind of stepped into that role. And it runs schools, hospitals, until this very day. But again, it was seen as something that was temporary. But because the issue has been persistent and has been ongoing, it's had its mandate renewed year by year by year, and is ongoing. Although, again, Mr. Trump has just said he's going to cut funding to the organization. So, in a nutshell, you have two organizations that had different roles, and that also appeared to define their roles differently. So the way in which refugees were defined was slightly different. So UNRWA, for example, if you was connected really to the loss of a homeland in 1948. The UNCCP was slightly different. It was more concerned with citizenship, those who were nationals. So it wasn't just about refugees, because not all people who lost their properties or who would be clarified as refugees. So if you got another even if you acquired citizenship in another country, you still may have had property in the mandate. So UNCCP would still be involved, but you wouldn't fall under UNRWA's role. I won't say too much about the UNHCR because Francesca's addressed this. Just to point out that Palestinians are excluded except under Article 1D, which says that when protection or assistance ceased for any reason, and if the position of these people was not definitely settled in accordance with relevant resolutions adopted by the UN, i.e. 194 about right of return, these people would ipso facto be entitled to the benefits of this convention. If you read that literally, that means if they fall outside UNRWA's area, they should fall under the protection of the UNHCR, because the issue has not been resolved. And I come to the final part of my talk, and that's the failure of the peace process. The first talks that took place between the Arab states and Israel were in Switzerland, in Lausanne. I won't go into all the details, but at one point the Israeli government was willing to allow 100,000 refugees to return, but then there were different claims were made, and it kind of withdrew from that claim. But this is a nice quote from Walter Eitan, the Director General of the Israeli Foreign Ministry, which kind of, I think, in a nutshell, provides the Israeli position at the time, which hasn't really changed. And they said, "There can be no return to the status quo, as I have been at pains to demonstrate since the destruction wrought by war and the changes brought about by immigration have decisively and unalterably transformed the whole aspect of the country. The clock cannot be turned back. If an Arab refugee counts upon living again in the house he abandoned, or plying his trade in the workshop he formerly rented, or tilling the fields in the vicinity of the village he once knew, he is living under an illusion, which it seems to me essential to dispel. And since then there was another war in 1967. The number of refugees increased. There were peace talks. There's been so many peace talks. Most well-known ones at Oslo, Camp David, Annapolis. More recently under John Kerry. There's also the Arab Peace Initiative. That always refers to Resolution 194. It's complicated because UNRWA includes refugee descendants. So not just the original refugees, but also their children. It's kind of got a patrilineal line, are also considered refugees, so the numbers just increase. And this graph will show you the numbers. Again, this is just in the areas where UNRWA operates. So according to statistics as of the 1st of January 2016, there were just over 5.2 million refugees, and these are showing the areas. But again, this doesn't include UNHCR statistics, so it's probably much higher than that. And again, to show you the different positions, as of today, this is just pulled off the PLO website and Israel's Foreign Ministry website. The PLO position, and I'm going to finish very shortly, is our vision requires a just solution to the Palestinian refugee issue in accordance with international law. And again, they refer to UN General Assembly Resolution 194 and a right of return and reparations. The State of Israel says it doesn't bear any culpability for the creation or the perpetuation of the Palestinian refugee problem. The Arab countries, with the sole exception of Jordan, have perpetuated the refugee problem in order to use it as a weapon in their struggle against Israel. So to conclude, the persistence of the Palestinian refugee problem is, as I said at the beginning, due to the specific historical circumstances. During the League of Nations period, the Holocaust, if you like, the failure to transfer power at the end of the League of Nations period, the kind of ad hoc role of the UN that this occurred before the 1951 convention existed, or regime existed, and the fact that peace talks have continued to go nowhere. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Victor. Thank you very much for keeping time. Next speaker will be Ms. Naila Arigori Hamse. Her presentation title will be investigating the cause behind the lack of integration of Afghan refugees in Iranian society.
Okay, thank you. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Before starting my presentation, I would like to have a special thanks to the organizer of this conference, and also have a special thanks to my supervisor, Professor Matsunaga, for providing me this opportunity. So the topic of my presentation is investigating the causes behind the lack of integration of Afghan refugees in the Iranian society. Afghans' migration into Iran has a long history. However, in my paper, I only have focused on the largest and the most problematic one. That is the mass influx of around 3 million Afghan refugees who fled Afghanistan and took refuge in Iran following the Soviet Union invasion to this country. This period was coincident with the Islamic Revolution in Iran and the trigger of Iraq-Iran war. However, Iran unconditionally opened its border to the influx of Afghan refugees. Afghan refugees who entered Iran settled primarily in eastern counties of Mashhad, Torbat-e-Jam, and Torbat-e-Haydariye, and then scattered into other counties and provinces. Ever since 1979, Iran has had a large population of Afghan residents, roughly on the scale of at least 2,800,000 at any time. They mainly entered the country through the Islamgale and Dogarun borders. This picture shows Afghan population density in Iran as for 2016. As you can see, Tehran is the densest spot. After that, Khorasan Razavi, Isfahan, Kerman, and Fars have respectively accommodated the largest number of Afghan population. Only 3% of this population chose to stay in the settlements shown in the picture, and the rest resided in different cities. Those settlements were administered by Bureau of Aliens and Foreign Immigrant Affairs, or BAFIA. BAFIA, as part of the Ministry of Interior, was established in early 1980s, and it is responsible for refugee matters. And this graph shows the population of Afghan refugees in Iran from 1979 to 2016. During their long presence in Iran, Afghan refugees have gone through two opposite experiences of being accepted as honorable guests and of being rejected as unwanted burdens. Now, the second generation is suffering from identity crisis without having any sense of attachment and belonging to their host community. So the question is that, what accounts for such lack of integration? The answer is rooted in part in the Iranian refugee policy changes and the consequent dramatic perversions in various laws concerning refugees' rights. I will not go into details of this policy shift, but will give my view on its implication on the Afghan refugees' status under three periods. The first period is from 1979 to 1992, which I would call the blue card period. The second period would be the post-blue card period during 1992 to 2003, and the current period of Amayesh, which has started from 2003. All the Afghan nationals who entered Iran during 1979 to 1992 were issued with blue cards, which granted them citizenry based on their nationality. However, their status in those cards was indicated as involuntary migrants. In other words, from the initial stage of Afghans' presence in the country, the Iranian state refused to grant them refugee status. Although the blue card holders were not accorded the status of refugee, the Iranian government provided them indefinite permission to stay in Iran legally. Until 1995, blue card holders had access to free healthcare, basic education, and subsidized food and other basic essentials on the same terms as Iranian citizens. However, they were barred from owning their own businesses, and their employment was limited to 16 designated menial low-wage occupations. Receiving three more influxes of Iraqi, Azeri, and Afghan refugees, besides the domestic economic and social concerns, made the Iranian state to revise its refugee policy to emphasize prevention and repatriation. Accordingly, it stopped expanding the blue cards and finally declared them invalid in 1996. Following its refugee policy shift, Iran formalized its first repatriation program for Afghans in late 1992. In 2003, under Article 138 of the Constitution, Iranian state introduced various regulations on accelerating repatriation of Afghan nationals, which was followed by further measures to induce Afghans to return, mainly by raising the cost of living for them. And except 5% of Afghans who were settled in 30 camps built till 1998, the rest, 95%, who have been living in rural and urban areas, have not had access to any assistance from United Nations High Commissioner for Refugees. And also, those who were not settled in the camps were required to apply for temporary laissez passer through local authorities in the province where they resided. In 2003, Iran introduced a new identification system known as Amayesh. And this is a sample of Amayesh card. The Amayesh project for Afghan refugees was conducted during 2003 and 2004 to re-register all Afghan nationals with residency rights in Iran. Under these projects, all Afghan nationals residing in Iran are classified by a law into documented and undocumented. Amayish cards needed to be renewed annually. Under this law adopted by the parliament, employment, accommodation, access to different facilities and administrative services for those Afghans who does not have Amayish card were prohibited, and those transgressor Iranians who employed them or rent them accommodation would be subjected to prosecution. Also, when I was doing my field research on Afghan issues in Iran, I visited a refugee camp in the city of Semnan. Many of the Afghans residing in that camp, whom I did personal interviews with, were complaining about the increasing annual cost that they have to pay for their cards get renewed, and increasingly complex and bureaucratic process they had to go through with the Iranian authorities to retain their status, which after all would be generally valid for 1 year. Failing to extend Amayish cards may subject the cardholders to deportation. There were some cases that the parents have been arrested and sent to Afghanistan while their little children have remained in Iran. So, as I argued, the state's refugee policy shift faced the prospect for naturalization of documented Afghans, a serious obstacle. In 2010, the solution strategy for Afghan refugees plan was developed to support voluntary repatriation, which made the prospect for Afghans' nationalization even less probable to occur. The most recent Amayish registration scheme carried out by Bafia in 2015, and 950,000 Afghans were issued with Amayish card, which officially determined their status as refugees. To legalize the status of around 2 more million undocumented Afghan nationals, the Iranian government issued around 800,000 Afghans with identification documents by 2013. However, both Amayish card holders and those with temporary residence visa are equally subject to the same legal constraints on issues like real property ownership, marrying Iranian nationals, and freedom of movement. And gaining Iranian citizenship is not an option for both groups either. Based on the Iranian nationality law, neither the second and third generation of Afghan refugees, nor even the children of Iranian mothers and Afghan fathers who have born in this country can attain Iranian nationality, and both groups remain without citizenship. And there are near 35,000 children to Iranian mothers and Afghan fathers who do not have any national identity, and the government does not recognize them as Iranian. However, according to a single article law and its amendment ratified by the parliament recently, those children were given the right to apply for Iranian citizenship within 6 years after reaching 18-year-old under some condition. Another obstacle in the naturalization process of Afghan nationals in Iran is the strategy of Afghan free zones. In order to maintain the Sunni Shia population proportionality and to have the security conditions in Sunni settlers' provinces under control, the Iranian government declared some of those provinces to be partially or fully off limits to all Afghan nationals. Accordingly, Afghan nationals are not allowed to enter in the declared no-go areas, or more popularly known in Iran as Afghan free zones. This banning is also another obstacle in the naturalization process of Afghan nationals in Iran. One of the most controversial issues regarding Afghan refugees in Iran is about the wide attendance of Afghan youth in Syria battlefields. The first generation of Afghan refugees have gone through the similar experience in Iraq-Iran war, during which around 3,000 Afghans were killed. Now the second and third generation is fighting in Syria. but the complexity of this tragic issue makes it different. Afghan youth, mainly Shia Hazaras, are dispatched to Syria by the Revolutionary Guard Corps elites. There are no official figures of the number of Afghans who are fighting there and of those who have been killed there so far. And hundreds of pictures of Afghans killed in Syria could be seen all around the cities of Tehran, Karaj, and Semnan, the sites where I visited while doing my field research. Human Rights Watch accused Iran of preying on vulnerable Afghan refugees, recruiting and sending them to fight in Syria. Iranian officials, however, always denied any accusation of forced recruitment of Afghans. The point is that definitely there is a circumstantial incentives for them to go and fight and die in Syria. Not having a real-life option in Iran, they might indeed volunteer to go and fight. And during my visit of Semnan refugee camp, I met three, During my visit of Semnan refugee camp, I met three families who had lost their youth in Syria. The old father of the most recent martyr said me that he was called in Kabul and he was informed of his son's death in Syria and that he was promised by the Iranian authorities a monthly pension. And he had three more sons, all of them were in Syria at that time. And when I asked him, why do you let them go there knowing that they might be killed? He said, we are Muslim. They have gone for the sake of Imam Ali and Ahl Bayt. However, other Afghans in the camp had another opinion. They said he was afraid of losing his privileges. That's why he was not telling the truth. Camp settlers said that Afghan youth are going to Syria because they are hopeless, they are jobless, they have no better option, and they are going with the hope to contribute to their families' living condition, since the Iranian government has promised them to grant them their families permanent residence permit and to provide them with monthly pension. Apart from the circumstantial incentives for Afghans to go and fight in Syria, we see the instrumental use by the powerful forces in Iran of vulnerable Afghan refugees' families for the country's strategic operations in Syria. Okay. As I explained, at the institutional level, the state's refugee policy shifting faced the integration of Afghan refugee into Iranian society with serious legal and administrative obstacles. Regarding social integration, their prolonged stay and their competition in Iran's labor market has gradually generated a common sentiment among Iranians that Afghan refugees have taken away job opportunities from them. Moreover, due to cultural gap, Afghan social, cultural, and economic patterns of living made them stand out socially more than needed, which arose different social interactions from Iranian society. In one of the most recent cases, the inhabitants of a small town in the city of Yazd gathered in front of an Afghan school and forced the school authorities to disperse the Afghan kids and to close the school. So, to conclude, according to the finding of my papers, the most fundamental decisive factor behind the lack of integration of Afghan refugees is rooted in the lack of recognition in their status as refugees from the very first days of their attendance in Iran. Calling them as muhajirin and considering their presence as to be temporary, and the government refusal to grant them refugee status all means that they were not supposed to be integrated in the Iranian society from initial. In all the three periods under study, this initial decision have been a leading factor in strategies adoption and measures taken by later governments. The second period can be best characterized as the repatriation period. Shifting in its economic incentives and priorities, Iranian officials found Afghan refugees best excuse to put blame on for economic problems, poverty, unemployment, and social disorders. Consequently, the government gradually and consistently cut back on some public services, such as free access to education, healthcare, and subsidized transport, fuel, and basic goods. The main aim during Amayish period was to recognize Afghan national statuses, not being successful in both forced and voluntarily repatriation program, and the urgent need of the Iranian labor market to the Afghan cheap laborers, the government had to revise its stance from focusing on repatriation to reorganizing the Afghan population in Iran into documented and undocumented foreign nationals. Accordingly, the government has been trying to focus its measures mainly to exploit Afghan refugees' presence for the country's economic advantage, while at the same time trying to reduce the economic and security cost of their presence by more strictly controlling their population through the Amayish programs. Thank you for your listening.
Thank you very much, Naira. Next speaker will be Professor Sasaki and Professor Ogawa. Their presentation title is Migrant Care Workers in Japan, Trained or Exploited. When you're ready, please.
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting us as speakers today. I'm Ayako Sasaki and she's Reiko Ogawa. We are both from Chiba University. Our presentation is neither on the Middle East countries nor on the refugees, but about migrant care workers and the international students in Japan, which we hope that will somehow contribute to develop the relational studies. In a super aging society, where 26.7% of the population, or more than 30 million people, are over 65 years old, the sustainability of social security as well as service provision on long-term care has become a major social issue in Japan. It is estimated that labor shortage in the field of long-term care will reach 380,000 in 2025, and the Japanese government has been mobilizing Japanese care workers who are certified to return to the labor market, but without success. In this presentation, we will use the term care workers for long-term care workers or elderly care workers, and examine how they are politically stratified within the category of high-skilled and unskilled, and will be placed as political pawns through the rhetoric of training and education. We define pawns as a person who does not have any real power, but is used by others to achieve something. So migrants are utilized in multiple ways to meet the demand of the Japanese state and the market. There are at least 3 channels for the migrants to enter care work. Firstly, economic partnership agreements called EPA. Secondly, the plan of accepting 300,000 international students by 2020. And thirdly, Technical Internship Training Program, or TITPs. As illustrated in the box on the right side, EPAs are accepted as highly skilled, while down toward the bottom indicate that the migrant will be treated as unskilled. Care work requires language skill in addition to caregiving skill, which actually means that the migrant will be differentiated into each channel depending on their human capital, including their language level. This presentation will also demonstrate that aside from using migrants as care workers, there is a post-migration processes or second stage in using migrants after they return to their home countries. Currently, Japanese government has tried to export health, medical, and silver businesses through the rhetoric of universal health coverage. This policy is called Asian Human Wellbeing Initiative, aiming at promoting Japanese-style care in other Asian countries and creating jobs for trained and educated migrants after they return. We will explore how these policies are interrelated to make the great use of migrants and place them as double funds.
So I will elaborate the three channels of accepting migrants as care workers, which enables as well as constrains them. Despite of the demographic pressures and shrinking population, Japanese policy to introduce labor migrants are reactive, hodgepodge, and lacks neither coherent strategy nor long-term vision. The first wave of migrant care workers came under the Economic Partnership Agreement, which is basically a free trade agreement between the Philippines, Indonesia, and Vietnam. So the migrants came from these three countries. In line with the immigration policy to accept only the highly skilled workers, Japanese government made a political compromise to accept migrant nurses and care workers. So this was contingent, or rather testing the waters. In a closed country like Japan. During the negotiation, there was a proposal from the Japan Nursing Association for migrant nurses to pass the national exam in order to ensure the safety in the hospitals. The care workers followed the same framework. So for EPA care workers, it became mandatory to pass the national exam on care work in Japanese within 4 years. And if they cannot pass, they have to return. All the migrants who come under EPA are either university graduates or nursing school graduates. Migrants will receive 1 year free Japanese language training and continue to study while working. So you can see in the picture that this is in a care facility in the western part of Japan, that the people are studying Japanese as well as care work while they are working. The government agencies are in charge of recruitment, deployment, training, and allocation of caregivers, so there is no financial burden on the side of the migrants. And as of 2017, 3,000 plus nurses and care workers are working in Japan, and together with 200 plus families that they could bring in. So the second channel is about the international students, which we think that there's a high possibility of becoming a bonded labor. In order to attract the highly skilled workers, Japanese government target to invite 300,000 international students, including those in the university, vocational schools, and Japanese language schools. In the field of care work, there are approximately 400 caregiving schools all over Japan, which are consisted of 2-year vocational schools, 2-year junior colleges, and 4-year universities. However, the Japanese younger generations are not interested in taking up this occupation. And in 2017, only 45.7% of the capacities for students' enrollment were filled in. So in other words, the caregiving schools are facing a major challenge to be sustainable. There's a medical visa for medical professionals such as doctors and nurses, but there was no care work visa, so the international students who obtained the certificate could not stay and work. However, in 2017, care work visa has been created. In other words, to kill 3 birds in 1 stone. So once international students become a certified care worker, they can stay for indefinite period of time. Caregiving schools can fill in their capacity of students, and the care sector will fill in the labor shortage. So this is the number of the students who are studying in caregiving schools, and as you can see, it's sort of doubled, and particularly in some countries like Vietnam. So the third channel that I would like to explain is called Technical Internship Training Program, which serves as a de facto guest worker program. Well, this started in the 1980s, but expanded rapidly in the 1990s, where the labor shortage has been felt. The basic premise of this program is to transfer skills and knowledge to developing countries as part of the international cooperation. However, the hidden aim is to secure unskilled workers without allowing them to settle. TITP has become a de facto channel for importing cheap, unskilled labor and has been severely criticized by civil society as well as the international community, including the UN. Due to weak enforcement of labor laws and lack of proper monitoring systems, rampant cases of violation of human rights happened, as you can see in the table. Approximately 300 run away every year, disappear and go undocumented. Currently, there are more than 250,000 people, TITPs, from Vietnam, China, and the Philippines, and other countries. And they are working in 77 occupations in the field of agriculture, fishery, construction, welding, metal processing, and etc. In 2017, under the Abe administration, elderly care work has been included in the occupation list, together with a requirement for Japanese language proficiency level for the first time, as care work needs certain level of communication, as you can imagine. The migrant care workers who come under TITPs are expected to have Japanese language proficiency level N4, which is actually consisted of 5 levels, and N4 is the second level from the lowest that allows you to do very basic conversation, like we have a good weather today, something like that. After 1 year, they are required to obtain N3, that is 1 level higher, as a condition to work for the maximum period of 5 years. Some care facilities are very cautious in using TITPs, as the required level of Japanese language proficiency is very low. But due to the chronic shortage of care workforce, the others do not have choice but to turn to TITPs in order to keep their business running. So now I would like to explain how the training in the field of these 3 different channels work as a rhetoric that make the migrant care workers as pawns. For EPAs, the government provide language training and subsidized care facilities to support migrants in preparation for the national exam in care work. Well, this is not under any generous concern, but driven from diplomatic and economic interest to maintain the government-to-government agreement to save the face. The passing ratio for EPA care workers is about 50%, and the certificate allows the migrant to be employed at the equal level as the Japanese staff. Currently, there are several hundred certified migrant care workers who are now working in Japan, but as their stay prolongs, it becomes clear that long-term care work is not considered as skilled work, but devalued in Japanese society and shunned away by locals. Also, obtaining the certificate of care worker does not lead to increase in salaries in any major way. The training and obtaining the certificate become a rhetoric to be, quote-unquote, professional care worker with citizenship, but without proper remuneration, social status, and long-term prospects for career development. For international students studying long-term care work, in principle, Japanese language proficiency level N2, which requires 1,000 to 2,000 hours of study, depending on whether you come from this Chinese character using country or not. It depends on the people of study, but 1,000 to 2,000 hours is quite a lot. So in many cases, they have to be enrolled in Japanese language schools before they start studying long-term care. The tuition fee for 1 year in language school and 2 years in caregiving schools, together with their living costs, add up to several million yen by the time they become certified care workers. The local government provides student loans, which does not even cover the tuition fee, so the students have to work as part-time care workers under the name of on-the-job training. However, they are most likely to be placed in menial jobs which does not require language skills. And even though they can legally work for 28 hours per week with minimum wage, they will barely be able to sustain their living costs in expensive cities like Tokyo. Even before the establishment of the new visa of care work, some schools have already started accepting international students to fill in their slot. In 2016, the caregiving schools in Tokyo had 48 international students, but only 8 could graduate due to language and financial issues. The international students will be taken advantage of, first as students to sustain the language school and caregiving school, by paying tuition fees, and secondly, as cheap part-time workers in care facilities. These structural conditions turn international students to become bonded laborers. And finally, for TITPs, they are specially required to have the Japanese proficiency level N4, which requires more than 300 hours of study. In recent years, numerous language schools mushroomed both in Japan and in descending countries like Vietnam, and Japanese language training becomes a fertile ground for exploitation. Private recruitment agencies in both sides are actively seeking for profit from both the employers and migrants, and without regulation, the fees can vary. According to the estimate that I have obtained, Company A, which is like a recruitment agency, charges US $3,500 for training, insurance, placement fees, and travel fees to be charged from the employers for the first year. But Company B charges US $6,200 for the same or similar services, while the migrants will be only paid with minimum wage. Since the training in Japanese language is very costly, the wage of the migrants has to be kept very low in order to make their business viable. The requirement for training becomes a good reason for private agencies to maneuver and charge exorbitant fees for the services from both employers and migrants. For all three channels, Japanese language and care work skills serves as non-tariff barriers to migration that justifies the rhetoric of training and education. This rhetoric becomes a powerful tool for the EPAs to believe that care work is professional work, that promises citizenship in Japan. For international students, the rhetoric convinced them to invest in their education and undertake part-time jobs in care facilities under the name of OJT, while they are doubly exploited, first as students and secondly as cheap laborers, and risking themselves to become bonded laborers. For TITPs, they have to invest in language training just to come and work for maximum 5 years with minimum wage.
As Reiko explained, previous researches demonstrate that EPA returnees use financial, human, and social capitals to compensate their skill drain. I've researched a total of 17 Indonesian EPA care workers and returnees in 2015 and 2016. 7 Indonesians still working as care workers in Japan, and 10 are already back in Indonesia. 4 out of 10 passed the national exam but went back to Indonesia. As Reiko discussed, I also found out that the 10 returnees' current working conditions can be categorized as 3 types. The first one is working in the healthcare field, such as healthcare manager in senior living for the rich in Indonesia, which was built jointly by Indonesian and Japanese companies. The second one is working within Japan-related industries as translators or staff. The third category, others, include Japanese language and caregiving related to education and training school, housewives, and one was unemployed at that time. Some wanted to open an own academy in the near future or work as teachers by using their EPA skills and experiences. If it seems that their career path is not limited within the healthcare field, but they are exercising their agency by using the human and social capitals which they acquired through working in Japan. Well, as Reiko also explained, international students have a risk to fall into bonded labor, so I will show an example of how recruitment of international students for caregiving field works. Some of the owners of care facilities in Japan started a Japanese language school recruiting international students. This is a flyer from Japanese language school recruiting international students in their home countries. It says opportunity for internship, especially targeting students who have a bachelor or diploma in nursing without explaining the whole procedure, including the costs such as tuition fees and living costs in Japan. The flyer was distributed by high school teachers, university professors, churches, the people who can easily be trusted. Applicants paid recruitment fees and submitted their official record of education, birth certificate, and so forth to the recruitment agency in home country, and after they come to Japan, they have to pay tuition and living cost from their earnings. After completing the Japanese language school, they might proceed to a caregiving school only if they are capable to acquire enough Japanese language skills and manage their financial situation. Otherwise, they have to go back to their home countries only with debt. Okay. In the presentation, we have explored how migrants and international students are politically and economically used to meet the shortage of care workers in Japan. The Japanese government's Cabinet Office has promoted Asian Human Well-being Initiative to expand Japanese health and medical industries and help realizing universal health coverage in ASEAN countries. Returned migrants and international students who are supposed to be trained and educated in Japan will be tapped by Japanese companies, which is trying to expand their businesses overseas. We have to see how it goes from a long-term perspective, but currently the plan emphasizes exporting of Japanese-style long-term care looks like another ambitious Great East Asia co-healthy sphere where returned migrants have a role to play. The way the training and education has been organized as well as the policy initiative of the Japanese government effectively visualizes that Japanese way of care is superior compared to those in the sending countries of migrants and contribute to strengthen the ethno-nationalism of Japan. The way in which Japanese style of care has been enforced to other countries resonate with the assimilation policy during the colonial period that now takes a new form under neoliberal globalization. As care is embedded in different care regime, gender laws, and social culture and economic context of each country, migrants should be able to develop their capacity and agency and use these experiences for their own well-beings. Thank you very much for listening.